Yesterday I tested out the Nioh 3 demo and I had some problems with it, and many of them on further investigation are significantly worse than I thought in that video, although some things are slightly better. Also, you may notice I'm filming the monitor directly right now rather than my usual just capturing the gameplay footage through an HDMI capture card. More on why I'm doing that in a second. Let's zoom in on the screen rather than my face. Okay, let's start with one of the things that is actually slightly better than I thought in the video, or actually it's something I suspected was the case but didn't have a chance to check out, which was the frame rate cap situation. So in the video when I was on a 60 FPS capture card, there did not seem to be any way to go beyond 60 FPS. Now, by filming the screen directly plugging into a monitor that's capable of 240 Hertz, we can now see that the game does allow to go up to 120. Now, it does not seem to allow me to go above 120, despite the fact that this is a 240 Hertz display. Although if you use frame generation, I believe it can actually go to the doubling the frame rate mode, but that's through frame generation. So the engine itself, at least as far as I can tell on my 240 Hertz display, seems to only allow it to go to 120 as far as the actual frame rate of the game. Now, at least that's better than a 60 FPS lock, which is what we see from Elden Ring and Dark Souls and other From Software titles. So there's some advantage here, and that's at least slightly better than what I was noticing in my video. But let's talk about these locked frame rates, because that is one of the things that is significantly worse on my further investigation. Now, this is also one of the reasons why I'm filming the screen directly. Now, I'm going to try to do a smooth camera pan here using a game controller, just kind of holding down the joystick a little bit. Now, one of my problems with filming this in a YouTube video is that you are seeing a 60 FPS capture of, filming a screen. So it's not a perfect representation of variable refresh rate behavior. You can see that we're at around 45 or so FPS as we spin around. It changes a little bit based on the camera angle. However, what I can see very clearly in person, but you may or may not be able to see in the video, hopefully this captures it, I'm trying my best by filming the screen directly, is that the frame pacing is horrendous here. It's jumping awfully from one frame to the next and very inconsistently. It looks horrible. Now, 45 FPS isn't amazing, but 45 FPS or so with smooth frame pacing on a controller with a smooth camera pan generally looks fine on a variable refresh rate display. And to be clear, this is a G-Sync compatible display, FreeSync with G-Sync compatibility. So the frame pacing that we're getting here when I move the camera is significantly less consistent than it should be, and it makes the game feel like it's running much worse than it actually is when you're measuring the frame rate. And it seems to be an issue with the camera. Now, when I was searching for other games that use the Katana engine and the kind of performance that they get, I noticed that this is not unique to this particular game. This seems to be a problem with the Katana engine. Now, when I'm actually just in combat fighting enemies, it feels fairly smooth. So it seems to be mostly an issue that presents itself when you are, like I said, smooth panning the camera. So camera motions feel abnormally bad given the frame rate using this engine, unless you're actually locking to the target frame rate. So this engine seems to really want you to be locked to a specific frame rate. Like if I lock to 30 FPS, believe it or not, my camera pans actually feel smoother than they did when I was running at a much higher frame rate, which would make sense if you're on a non-variable refresh rate display. But I'm on a variable refresh rate display. 45-ish with some variance should be smoother than a consistent 30 if the variable refresh rate is working properly and the game has proper frame pacing. But we're just not seeing that here in this game. So the way this game seems to be set up is that you really kind of have to be consistently hitting a specific frame rate lock in order to have a decent experience with this. And by the way, VSync was turned off there. Like it's not like VSync capting, and yes, I have variable refresh rate enabled. So that's how this goes. So when I'm targeting 120 FPS, but I'm actually only hitting in the mid 40s, things just end up really, really choppy with the camera panning output. Now, the other thing that's worse than what I initially reported is the actual just performance of the game. So this is still running on an RTX 3060 on a 1440p output with a DLSS quality-ish at 65% internal rendering scale, without the dynamic resolution scaling. And you'll notice that a lot of the time I'm in the 40s. In my testing yesterday, which was in an earlier portion of the demo, my frame rate was more consistently in the mid 50s or even locking to 60 when using these same resolution scaling settings. So once you hit the open world, the game is significantly more demanding. And so I thought that was also important to note. So these are the settings I'm using here, currently with dynamic resolution scaling turned off. Now, if I try to turn dynamic resolution scaling on to target, let's say 60 FPS, you can now have a minimum resolution scale, which seems to be 50% at the minimum, which would be DLSS performance. Then you can have a maximum. I'm gonna say like we could go up to 100% if it was capable of it. So now it's gonna let the resolution go as low as possible in order to hit the 60 FPS target. The problem is, notice that here it still can't hit the 60 FPS lock, which means my camera pans are still very juddery, despite the fact that we're nearly 60 FPS. And on a variable refresh rate display, this should feel almost indistinguishable from 60 FPS. But because of that weird issue with the game engine and the camera panning when you're not locked to 60 or 30, or I guess 120, it seems to cause some problems with the smoothness. Now you can see that you can, if I'm staring down at the ground, we can get some higher frame rates. But when you're in the open world areas with foliage and enemies, etc., even going down to DLSS performance here doesn't seem to quite be getting us where we need to go. Also, if you look at the CPU cores in the top left, especially when I'm moving, you can see that the CPU usage is almost completely capped out as well. So even if my GPU could go higher here, the CPU doesn't leave us a lot of extra headroom, which means that even if I lower the rendering resolution, so let's say that we're actually just trying to play at 1080p, and I'm allowing it to go into DLSS performance mode if needed, right? This can scale all the way down to 50%. In fact, let's actually just turn off the dynamic scaling entirely, and let's just go down to 50% resolution. So this is DLSS performance mode with no dynamic scaling on a 1080p output. So we're looking at basically 540p internal rendering resolution. You can see that we are able to get up into the 70s or so, but the CPU usage is still really high, and we're not really able to get any like super consistent frame rates. Also, things don't look super great with this low of internal rendering resolution. So that is a bit of a problem. Now, we could also actually target even lower internal rendering resolution just to kind of push that idea even further, although it looks like I'm getting attacked right now, so let's get out of here. So we're now doing 360p up to 1080p output. Now you can notice that the GPU usage percentage is only kind of in the 80s. So what we're seeing now is the limits of the CPU. Now this is the recommended CPU from the game's Steam system requirements. The recommended CPU is a Ryzen 5 5600X, which is exactly what I'm using here. So the recommended CPU does seem to be able to go over 60 FPS, at least in this area, but not by a lot. In other words, this is going to be a tough game to get super high frame rates. Because also if a 5600X is kind of capping out in the mid 70s, you're going to need an extremely fast CPU to consistently stay over 100 FPS. And also, I'm not necessarily in the most demanding area of the game yet. This is just kind of a slightly more open world section of the demo. I would imagine there's probably particular areas that do a lot worse than this. Now, so far the graphics is, I keep forgetting you can't actually like pause, it seems like. The graphic settings could be set a bit lower, but it's kind of where we're capping out here. Now, I think for the rest of the testing in this video, I do want to test out some other hardware, and I'll probably go back to HDMI capture, but I wanted to point out some of these issues on a screen that could go above 60 and that could show off some of those camera panning problems. Okay, I've switched back to HDMI capture through a second PC's capture card rather than filming the screen, and I've also switched to exactly the recommended system requirements from the game's Steam system requirements page. RTX 3060 Ti and a Ryzen 5 5600X CPU, so same CPU I was using on the 3060 recordings. Now, also, on the game's PC system requirements, it says that this exact recommended setting should get you 1080p at the standard graphics preset at a 60 FPS lock with some upscaling. It's clear based on how the game seems to be designed that the upscaling is really a dynamic resolution scale to see, so the amount of resolution scaling should vary, but it claims this should hold 60 FPS. So what I want to do is first start by trying that out. In other words, let's test if we have exactly what the system requirements say. Now, also for some reason, my controller just died. So we're gonna switch to mouse and keyboard controls. And oh no, and I have inverted camera because I use that on controllers, but not mouse. Ooh, this is gonna be weird. All right, we're gonna not try to do any actual combat then while we're doing this. Just run around and see if we are indeed holding to these settings. So it does appear in the open world area that we are able to get this. Now, what kind of upscaling is actually applying? Now, that's one reason why I have this menu right down here. Wait, I can't do my pointy thing because I'm not using my green screen right now. Right there, right there. 720p internal out to a 1080p output. That's basically quality level upscaling. That's a DLSS thing you can turn on with a registry edit where it shows you the internal and output resolution. So it's looking like the dynamic res scaling is having to go down to DLSS quality to hold 60 FPS at 1080p. Out of curiosity, let's see if we could switch to native resolution by switching off dynamic scaling and then switching rendering resolution to 100% using DLAA. The game doesn't seem to have anything besides DLSS, FSR, and XESS, so we can't use like just a native TAA, I guess. It's gonna be DLAA. Now it says an extreme amount of video RAM is being used, which may result in severe bugs occurring. So it's saying at native resolution, we might be having VRAM related problems on the 8GB card, even at 1080p output. Also, we can see I'm definitely not hitting 60 FPS. We're in kind of the mid-50s. So the recommended hardware is absolutely not a locked 60 FPS at native 1080p. And notice we're not even on max graphics settings. The graphics settings here are the standard preset. There's a lot of other presets available. Now this is custom because I adjusted the resolution scaling, but to be clear, we are on the standard graphics preset. So standard quality for everything. Looks like standard includes high for the background mesh quality. So we're basically at the middle-ish settings for most things, and not quite locking to 1080p native. Now, it's a 3060 Ti. I get that's an older GPU, but honestly, like the 4060 Ti wasn't much more powerful, and the 5060 Ti is a little more powerful than that. But like a 3060 Ti, not completely outdated from a performance standpoint. And we're only looking at 1080p here. Also, one of my criticisms of this game is the visuals look sort of last gen. Like they're not bad, but for the performance that we're getting here, again, we're looking at about 52, 53 FPS as I run through here. That's kind of disappointing. Also notice how hard the CPU is working right now. The CPU is working really hard, which doesn't seem ideal. Now, it looks like it can get to 60 FPS at times at the native resolution, but it's a bit rough. Now, let's go ahead and adjust the visual settings a bit more. Let's go up to 1440p. If it can get there. 2560, oh, we died. Oh yeah, I forgot. The menu doesn't pause in this game. I was similar to other Souls type games, and I get that there is some online element to the game, so I guess I I kind of understand. It's sort of annoying when you're testing out the game, though. Or when you're a dad. This is a bit of a just random rant, but like the types of games that I've been able to play since having kids, especially like young kids that like need your attention, important issues at any possible moment, even when you thought they were good. Games without pause or without just quick save anytime you want, really inconvenient. Anyway, that's just a side note. Now, this is seeming to be fairly awful performance now, trying to do a native 1440p at the standard settings. Looks like we're around 30 FPS, dropping into the 20s once we actually are in motion. So that's a bit rough. Now, I think we're seeing both difficulties running it as well as just the VRAM constraints. And again, it is warning us of the VRAM usage. Again, for a game that doesn't have super detailed textures and stuff, the fact that it goes over 8 gigabytes of VRAM pretty easily, I think is certainly less than ideal. Now, that being said, we don't have to play at a native resolution. So let's drop to 65%, which is roughly DLSS quality, although not exactly, and see how that goes. So 1440p DLSS quality on the standard graphics preset, and getting some frame time spikes, which generally is consistent with running out of VRAM. So I've noticed some people say that the game is stuttery for them, and I wasn't seeing that in my testing on the 3060. On the 3060 Ti, I'm absolutely seeing that. So the difference here is the VRAM capacity. So I think if you're seeing stutters, there's a good chance that it's a VRAM-related problem, especially if you're on a GPU with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So I'd recommend turning some settings down, seeing if you can get the VRAM under control. That seems to be the problem that would be my diagnosis for what I'm seeing there with those stutters. Let's go down to 50%, which would be DLSS Performance mode. Again, 1440p output, but that's only 720p internal rendering. Again, we're on the standard graphics preset. And it looks like now we're holding to 60 at least some of the time without fully utilizing the GPU. So it does look like if we're willing to go down to performance mode, we can get that 60 FPS on the standard settings on the recommended hardware, at least in this area. Like I said, this area is a lot more demanding than the intro of the game, but I'm sure you could find particular areas in the open world that are more demanding. Now, this area, like looking over all the foliage and the long draw distance, etc., is fairly demanding. So we are able to hit 60 there. Again, CPU is working pretty hard as well. So there is that. Now, again, I think if we went ahead and went with the dynamic resolution scale, which seems to be what the game is kind of designed around, and allow it to go down to performance mode, we could then see if it could sometimes stay above that based on the needs of the moment. But if I look at my DLSS overlay in the bottom corner, it looks like internally we are at 720p. So it is seeming to have some problems with that. Also, I'm getting some stutters again when I adjusted that. So I think we may have spilled over some VRAM capacity issues again. All right, guys, to be honest, I've got to wrap this up. I've got to get my kids going to gymnastics, speaking of being a dad and all that. But basically, I've expanded on some of my thoughts on the game. The overall performance of the game, I think, is low considering the visual targets. It's also heavy on both the GPU and the CPU, and the VRAM capacity. All of those are problems. In addition to that, the weird frame rate capping choices are annoying, but combined with the fact that when you're not hitting those frame rate caps, the camera pans are really, really choppy, making the game feel less smooth than it should. All of these things have me severely question the technical side of this game, and it seems consistent with some other games from the Katana engine and this developer. So it seems to be just a bit of a problem with that engine. Now, I will say, though, that the bit I've played of the demo, I enjoy. So this is one of those games where I think the gameplay is good, but the technical aspects of the game are really letting it down. So hopefully these developers can find some upgrades to the engine in the future for future titles, and maybe those could even get backported as patches into this game. I don't know what the state of their engine or what they could do with that, but that would be my hope, because it seems like a good game, but does not seem like it's good from the technical standpoint. That's what I'm trying to say here. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. You could sound off with what kind of performance you're seeing on your hardware in the comments section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.